He had asked in plain and careful words for a wife who could cook, keep a garden and manage a household without fuss, and the woman who stepped off the stage at Blue Stem in a traveling dress worth more than his whole herd looked like she had never so much as boiled an egg in her life. Clay Winslow stood by the hitching post with his hat in his hands and watched her come toward him, and felt his carefully worded advertisement plain. Practical woman sought. No frills. Must no farm work crumble somewhere behind his teeth before he'd even said hello. Mr. Winslow, she had a voice like she'd practiced sounding ordinary and not quite managed it, all careful vowels and a posture that belonged in a parlor, not a ranch yard. I'm Rose Hartley. Ma'am. He shook her offered hand and noted, with a rancher's practical eye, that it was soft as a baby's, unmarked by a day's honest work, and felt his heart sink a little further with every observation. You said in your letter you'd kept house for your family some years. I did say that. A flush crept up her neck, quick and telling. It was mostly true, Mr. Winslow. Mostly. I supervised the keeping of it, she said, chin lifting with a stubbornness that struck him as either promising or alarming. He couldn't yet decide which. I directed the staff most capably. Clay Winslow closed his eyes briefly and thought of his empty cook stove, his overgrown garden, his 3 years of solitary bachelor cooking that had nearly killed him twice with its own carelessness, and understood that fate, or the postal service, had sent him precisely the opposite of everything he'd asked for. He had written the advertisement himself, careful and plain, after 3 winters of watching his own meals go from merely bad to genuinely dangerous, and after his neighbor's wife had gently suggested that a man alone on a ranch this size, doing a household's work and a rancher's both, would run himself into an early grave without help. He had not asked for beauty or charm in his letter. He had asked specifically and at some length for practicality, a woman who understood a garden's seasons, a stove's temper, and a household's endless small demands, because he had reasoned in his plain-spoken way that a marriage built on shared, sturdy competence would serve 2 lonely people better than one built on romantic notions neither of them had time left over to indulge. Looking now at Rose Hartley's soft hands and fine dress, and the particular stiff uncertainty of a woman standing on ground she had never once expected to occupy, he understood that whatever the postal service had delivered him, it was not what he had ordered, and he stood there a long moment simply trying to decide whether that was a disappointment or, against all his own careful reasoning, something else entirely. What Rose Hartley did not tell him that first evening, standing in his kitchen surveying a cook-stove she had genuinely never operated, was that her real name was Adelaide Merrick, daughter of one of Boston's wealthier shipping families, and that she had fled a betrothal to a man twice her age chosen for the size of his family's fortune rather than the size of his heart, with nothing but a satchel of clothes, a small purse of her own savings, and a mail-order bride advertisement she had answered on impulse from a newspaper she'd found discarded on the train, under a name that was not her own and a set of claimed skills that were, she now understood with growing horror, entirely invented. The fire goes in there, Clay said, pointing at the stove with the patient weariness of a man explaining something to a child, and the damper regulates the heat, and you'll want to. I understand the principle, Adelaide said, with more confidence than the situation warranted, and reached for the kindling with the same brisk certainty she'd once used to direct servants who actually knew what they were doing, and promptly filled the kitchen with smoke thick enough to choke a chimney sweep. Clay opened the windows and doors and stood in the yard while the smoke cleared, and looked at his intended wife coughing in the doorway with soot on her nose, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with disappointment at all. You've truly never cooked a meal in your life, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No, she admitted, and there was something almost defiant in the admission, as though she expected him to send her back on the next stage and had decided to face it squarely rather than beg. I've never cooked, never gardened, never done laundry with my own 2 hands, and I expect you have every right to put me back on that stage and write to some other woman who actually knows how to be useful." Clay considered her a long moment, the soot on her nose, the fine cut of her ruined traveling dress, the stubborn set of a chin that had clearly never once been told no and did not intend to start accepting it now, and found, to his considerable surprise, that he was fighting down a smile. "I didn't ask for useful exactly," he said. "I asked for practical. There's a difference, and I expect you might grow into the second even lacking the first if you're willing to be taught." "I'm willing," Adelaide said, too quickly, too eagerly, and then, quieter, more honest. "I don't have anywhere else to be willing for, Mr. Winslow. This is the only door I've got left open to me." He didn't ask what she meant by that, not that first evening, though the careful vowels and the ruined dress and the invented skills all told him plainly enough that this was a woman running from something, same as half the mail-order brides in the territory were running from something, and he had learned long ago not to pry at a wound before a person was ready to show it to him themselves. "Then I expect we'd best start with the fire," he said, and knelt down beside her at the stove and showed her, patient as he'd have been with a green colt, how to lay the kindling proper. It took her the better part of a month to learn to cook a meal that didn't require Clay's diplomatic silence to get through, and longer still to coax anything green and edible out of the garden plot behind the house, but she attacked each failure with the same fierce, stubborn determination she'd once reserved for winning arguments in her father's parlor, and Clay found himself, somewhat against his own better judgment, looking forward to supper each evening not for the food, which remained unreliable, but for the company, which had become the best part of his day. The second week brought a laundry disaster that left every shirt Clay owned dyed a peculiar shade of gray, after Adelaide mistakenly boiled his good white shirts alongside a dark blue Sunday dress she refused to explain the origins of. The third week brought a genuine triumph, a pot of beans, unburned, properly seasoned, that she served with the pride of a woman presenting a masterpiece, and Clay ate 2 full helpings purely to see her face light with the particular joy of a skill hard-won rather than given. She kept a small ledger of her own, hidden in her room, recording every small victory and failure alike, a habit she'd carried unknowingly over from a life of managing household accounts, though the accounts she kept now measured biscuits and beans instead of silver and linen. Clay, for his part, found himself teaching more patiently than he'd taught anyone in his life, kneeling beside her at the stove or crouched together over the stubborn garden rows, and discovered that he did not mind the teaching half so much as he'd expected to mind a wife who needed it. There was something in watching her learn, the fierce concentration, the refusal to be beaten by a squash vine or a temperamental oven, that reminded him of breaking a good young horse, not through force but through patience and small earned trust, and he found that the comparison, however unromantic it might have sounded spoken aloud, was in fact the deepest compliment he knew how to pay. By the 4th week she had stopped introducing herself as Rose Hartley in her own head, at least when she lay awake at night turning the day over, and had started thinking of herself simply as Clay's wife, a plain enough title that nonetheless felt more true to her than any name she had carried before it, invented or otherwise. "You burned the biscuits again," he observed one evening, not unkindly, turning one over in his hand like a geologist examining a curious rock. "I know I burned the biscuits." She sat down across from him with the particular exhausted dignity of a woman who had fought an entire war with a cook stove and lost every battle but was determined to win the campaign regardless. "I burned them because I was watching the garden instead of the oven, and the garden, Mr. Winslow, has finally produced a squash that I did not accidentally kill, and I consider that a fair trade for a burned biscuit." He laughed then, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't managed in the 3 lonely years since his first wife had died, and left him alone on the ranch with more work than any one man could rightly manage, and Adelaide watched the laugh transform his plain, weathered face into something she found she liked looking at rather more than she'd expected to. It was in the 5th week that the truth came out, not by her choosing but by circumstance. A newspaper arrived on the stage with a notice from Boston. A runaway heiress sought, reward offered. A description that matched her closely enough that Clay, reading it over his coffee, went very still and looked up at her with an expression she could not immediately read. "Adelaide Merrick," he said, quiet, and watched her face go pale. "That's you, isn't it? Not Rose Hartley at all." She did not deny it. She had promised herself, somewhere in the 5th week of failed biscuits and stubborn squash and a laugh she'd grown to treasure, that she would not lie to this man again once the lying became unnecessary, and it had clearly become unnecessary now. "Yes," she said. "I ran from a betrothal my father arranged to settle a business debt. The man is 51 years old and has buried 2 wives already and speaks to me the way a man speaks to a horse he's considering purchasing. I answered your advertisement because it was the furthest thing from Boston I could find in that newspaper, and I lied about my skills because I was afraid the truth would get me sent straight back to a life I could not bear to live." "And the reward?" "Is my father's money, offered for my return, which I expect he wants a good deal less out of love than out of the embarrassment of his daughter running off unwed." She lifted her chin, bracing for whatever judgment was coming, ready to be sent away same as she'd expected from the very first smoke-filled evening. "I'll go, if you mean to claim it or simply be rid of a wife who lied to get here. I've no right to ask otherwise." Clay set the newspaper down slowly, and something in his face had gone from stillness to something warmer, something that looked, if she dared to name it, like the plain and unadorned beginning of love. "I don't want your father's reward," he said. "And I've had 5 weeks now to judge exactly what kind of woman you are, Adelaide Merrick, and it isn't a liar, whatever name you gave me at the start. It's a woman who'd rather burn every biscuit in the territory than go back to a man who'd treat her like livestock, and who's worked harder these 5 weeks learning a life she never asked to be born into than most women born to it ever bother to. I don't much care what your letters said when I rode away for a wife. I care what I've seen with my own eyes since you got here." "You're not sending me back." "I'm not sending you anywhere," Clay said, "unless it's to ask you, plain and honest this time, whether you'd consider marrying a rancher who fell for a runaway heiress somewhere between the smoke and the squash, and hasn't got the first notion how to talk himself out of it now." "You wrote for a practical wife," she reminded him, though her voice had gone soft, disbelieving, hopeful in a way she had not let herself feel since Boston. "I've burned more meals than I've managed to serve fit to eat. I still can't tell a healthy hen from a sickly one. I have been, by any honest accounting, a rather poor bargain for a man who asked for competence above all else." "You've also learned more in 5 weeks than most folks manage in a year," Clay said, "and you did it with nobody forcing you to, and no reward waiting at the end of it but the chance to keep living a life you chose for yourself, instead of one your father chose for you. I've come to think that's worth a good deal more to a marriage than knowing which hen is sickly on the very first try. I can teach you the hens, Adelaide. I couldn't have taught you that particular kind of courage if you hadn't already carried it in with you." Adelaide Merrick, who had come to Blue Stem under a false name with a satchel of lies and a heart braced for the worst kind of rejection, found herself instead sitting across a rough kitchen table from a plain-spoken man, offering her the one thing her father's fortune had never managed to buy her: a choice, freely made, about the whole shape of her own life. "Yes," she said, and meant it more fully than she had ever meant any word in her carefully managed Boston life. "Though I'll warn you now, Clay Winslow, I intend to keep burning the occasional biscuit long after I've mastered the rest, purely so you remember exactly the sort of wife you actually got." He was still laughing when he came around the table and took her soot-marked hand in his, and told her, plain as he'd told her everything else since that first smoky evening, that he wouldn't have her any other way.